Hi, everyone. My name's Jessy Irwin. I'm going to be giving a talk today about communicating securely, or communicating security better with non-technical users. My apologies are here in advance. I may have had some nerves. I may have also drank a margarita. It might show up in some sort of forgetfulness. So you have that disclaimer, and you have been warned. So typically, I like to start talks off with a little who am I. If you don't know me already, hi, I'm Jessy. On Twitter, I am Jessysaurus Rex. I'm a dinosaur. I watch Jurassic Park and tweet about all the security problems. But I work at 1Password by day, and I pretty much tell everybody on the internet to stop using the same password everywhere all the time because it's making it way too hard for those of us on the defense side of security to try to keep them safe. Some of the other work that I do is working with educators and with students to try to inform them about how security works on the internet and to try to help them understand how to take care of themselves and their identities and the data that they are making out and putting in the world online. And I want to be able to show people how to make themselves safer and to really do that education piece so that we all have a better chance at keeping everyone more secure. So, a few warnings. This talk definitely is not a technical talk. I'm not going to be dropping any O-Day, I hope. If I do, it's completely accidental. I'm really going to be talking about people-centric approaches to technology and security. And a lot of this is going to be based on my own experience of turning pretty much every conversation I've had in the past 3 years into a conversation about security. And the people that I typically work with tend to be non-technical. As I mentioned, lots of teachers, lots of students. Even though I live in San Francisco and I'm in the middle of the Silicon Valley, my day-to-day work really involves engaging people who aren't up to their eyeballs in code and repos and GitHub and everything else that we've had to become accustomed to working with. I don't have a ton of data to back up what I'm saying because I haven't kept little tally marks and dashes for the past few years of conversations I've had. But I do know at some point, because of the really good questions that I have had, that I will be doing the work to write things up in a way that taps into some of the psychology behind communication and just some of the practices that I had to learn before I got into security, and I worked more on the marketing and communication side of things. So, disclaimers being said, we're going to have a little story time, because that's just how I do things. A few months ago, I had the flu. And when I get sick, I turn into a baby, and then I basically watch whatever I can put in front of my eyeballs that doesn't make me think too hard. And when I had the flu the last time, I decided I should probably just watch Lord of the Rings because I wasn't going to have to move. It'd be pretty entertaining. I knew what was going to happen. There'd be no ugly surprises. Well, I was watching The Fellowship of the Ring, which I've seen so many times I probably shouldn't really have watched it again, but I noticed a few things. There was one particular scene where there were some elves and there were some dwarves and some hobbits, some wizard dude, and they all found themselves up against a pretty big challenge. I mean, that's basically what the entire movie series is about. But it was a pretty diverse group of people, and they had a lot of different skill sets. That's not unlike what we deal with day to day on security teams. And they had an obstacle that they had to overcome while they were trying to avoid attackers. So after this group had made their way through some pretty ugly, pretty dangerous territory with some pretty nasty-looking malicious actors, I mean, orcs are pretty gross-looking. The makeup people did a great job making them look terrifying. These people found themselves at the base of a mountain, and they were looking for a door. And in the story, whether you are watching the movie or you're reading the book, the door is the Door of Durin. And the door is basically a passageway that leads through a bunch of mines that would help this group get through a mountain range. It was much safer to go under the mountains than above them because of the adversaries that they knew they would meet that were even worse than what was below. Sounds like a lot of fun, no? So the group needed to find this invisible door, or at least a door that was only visible to people who knew how to find it. They had a certain set of skills that they had to employ to track the thing down. This is kind of a regular thing that happens with dwarvish architecture. Sometimes the dwarves who made the doors couldn't even find them. But we should really talk about this door because I have some serious questions about its primes and the random number generators that are supposed to keep this mine and all this other stuff safe. In this particular case, they were looking for a way to get into the door. They found it, and they got a little lucky because the starlight happens to hit it the right way and movie magic happens. But boom, the door shows up, and there's some sort of password hint or some sort of phrase that's carved right in front of their faces. So the password hint's there, and it's speak friend and enter. And it looks like after all this searching and all the running away from orcs, all these guys are like, yes, we can get in. The password's right there. The password hint's right there on the side of the mountain, because that's exactly how you secure your password hints, no? And so they try to get in, and they say friend every which way they can. The password doesn't work, though. The door is pretty much immune to any kind of brute forcing and any kind of dictionary attack that they can come up with. So there's a little bit of red team fail going on there. And then the group steps back, and they have to rethink things a little bit. There's a little bit of a difference between how this happens in the book and how this happens in the movie. I happen to disagree with one of my coworkers about how this actually goes down. My defense here is that I had the flu, I had a fever, and I was probably high on cold meds, so you don't get to tell me how I saw the movie when I was sick. But these guys are standing there trying to get in, and they notice that, hey, wait a second. These doors, they were built by dwarves, and the language on the door is not their language. Something funny's going on here. They notice that the inscriptions are in Elvish. So, oh wait, hold on, this is actually a riddle. Okay, we can work with that. Hey, wait a second. We should use that language and see if it works. And they do. I'm not going to say the word out loud because I'll say it wrong. But they tried the Elvish word for friend, and the door opened. So now you're probably sitting here saying, what does this have to do with security? Well, besides the dwarves' inability to document their doors, how very juniper of them, there's some pretty poor password security practices. Pro tip, don't carve your password or password hints into the side of a mountain. And there's some pretty ineffective attacks trying to crack what the word is. But you do have a team of people who are doing all of this great, pretty thankless work that no one in their world really knows about. And they hit an obstacle. They keep throwing the same word at the problem, and they keep expecting different results, but they're not paying attention to all of the clues around them. So to me, when I'm in the middle of this fever dream, I'm thinking, wait a second, this scene looks really familiar. This looks like when I see my hacker friends go and try to explain to non-technical people why they should care about security and what matters. And usually, when my hacker friends start, they start using terms like encryption. Well, what is that? I don't understand. And then they get into cryptography. Well, what is that? I don't know what that is. And we all in this room know that those are very complex kinds of math that you literally have to have a PhD to be able to really get into and to change and to work with. If you want to be building cryptography from the ground up, another pro tip, please don't roll your own. Bad idea. But practitioners tend to speak in very technical terms, and it puts people who just aren't on that same ground at an utter disadvantage. We get really excited about our work, but then we don't know how to translate our excitement into things that other people can easily understand and get super excited about. So one of the things that I tend to think about when I am explaining technology, sometimes I call it Jessy-splaining technology. I'm sorry, I'm not sorry. But one of the things I tend to think about is my audience. And one of the first and most important things that you can do as a practitioner when you are doing security education is to know who you're talking to. When you figure out who you're talking to, and then you figure out what your end user or your audience knows, you can begin to do some of the groundwork that really helps you find a common ground with that person and their approach to the world to talk about security from. So for the most part, as I've already sort of mentioned, people don't understand technology very well. The vast majority of people in the workplace didn't get formal training or education that explains that the stuff in these things is not magic that makes them run. It's actually math and logic. So more often than not, People don't understand what's going on inside of the computer thing, and it seems so unapproachable that they don't know where a good entry point is to start learning. As a consequence of this, most people sort of start building their own sets of tools and rituals and practically have their own like little lucky white rabbit foot that they use when they're making up their own passwords to go and explore the internet. And in fact, if you're interested in social engineering, just ask people how they make their passwords. People are more than happy to share their little recipes and their algorithms and all of the little tips and tricks that they do that make them feel like they have a little bit of control when it comes to the internet, or make them feel like they're safe, even though a lot of the information that people run on tends to be outdated. It might have worked 10 or 20 years ago, but it just doesn't work for what we do today. More often than not, when we're talking to people about security, we have a really hard time finding where they're coming from. And one of the most important things we can do is to make sure that when we are discussing technology, we're not using technology words and then just throwing the same technology words at people and saying encryption, 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 when someone just doesn't know what encryption is. Repeating the same word multiple times, louder every time, doesn't help people actually figure out what the word means. When we throw a bunch of technical terms at people, there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anger, because sometimes people feel like they're being talked down to. And you typically don't see very much improvement in an initiative that you might be trying to get movement on, or even from support that you might get from someone at a business leader level in your company. Even worse, when it's time to have discussions about security and technology with colleagues or coworkers and family, the number one problem that we end up solving tends to be usability. People are more worried about being able to use a technology tool than being able to use a technology tool securely. So when people log into a new app or they download a new something on their phone, the first question is, how do I just get into this thing? How can I get online as quickly as possible? How can I make this task happen and then go through my whole day and not have to take 5 hours to make sure that everything is secure? More often than not, though, this kind of training and this kind of teaching turns into a step-by-step guide, and maybe it helps people save time because they know to look for a check mark or they know to look for a side menu. But it doesn't really do much else past that, because when you have your UI change and suddenly you log into the app and everything looks different, people are dependent on doing exactly what they know. And if that check mark or that menu or that one word that they know to look for is gone, they're completely lost because there's no mental model of the task that they're trying to accomplish there. If I open up my phone and I'm looking for a check mark and I'm looking for 3 lines and a dot, and the 3 lines and a dot aren't there, and I don't understand what all of those things mean together and what they're accomplishing, I'm probably not going to be asking a lot of critical questions about what else might be going on under the hood. One of the next things that I think about a lot when I talk about security is just content in general. Content is really key when you're trying to get people onto your side. If you want attention, you have to work for it. And there are a lot of things that we have to compete with to get attention and to get buy-in, and it's not easy. When you do have a user's attention, don't throw it away. One thing that I have had to learn in marketing very quickly was that people learn best through personalized content. They like stories, and they like being entertained. And yet, when it's time for us to talk about security in a school or in a workplace, typically we hand over an acceptable use policy, or we hand over something that's about this thick, and it's not a very fun read. It's usually pretty dense, and it's pretty boring, and it will put you to sleep. So when you present people with these kinds of jargon and this kind of legalese and a bunch of rules, people who don't understand what's going on inside of a phone or inside of a computer probably aren't going to try to navigate that either. It's not a good way to bring people onto your side. Another problem with this is sometimes users, non-technical users, tend to think that an acceptable use policy or a security policy in general is an educational document. So if you have very specific password constraints or very specific requirements for how often you should be changing passwords, Users say, well, wait a second, that's my iCloud password for work, and it says that I can only have these requirements and I have to do it in this amount of time, and that's my most important, most expensive, most valuable thing that I have to handle in my day-to-day work. Maybe I should make sure I do this everywhere. As we know, not every password policy is thought out that well. Not every rule that we hand over works to secure a person in every situation when they're transitioning from business responsibilities to things going on in their personal lives. So more often than not, when we pass down a bunch of rules, the ones that people pay attention to might not be good ones, and then they take those rules and they bring them into other areas of their life. In terms of content, especially when talking about security, my favorite delivery mechanism happens to be sign bunnies. Sorry, not sorry. But I learned something really important from viral media. We are in an age of viral media right now. And we all see, yesterday BuzzFeed was trying to explode watermelons with rubber bands. I don't know how that went. But we know a lot about what content works with people, and we're not really starting to put that to use in the security arena. If we know attention spans are short, and we know that it's okay to make learning fun, it's okay to take security content and to translate it into a list, or to use some GIFs to make someone laugh, to make a joke, to send a short video around, or to have some sort of fun, clickbaity, ridiculous quiz or test that people can really engage with and have fun with. If you make someone laugh or you teach them something in an unexpected way, they're going to remember it longer. They're going to remember how you made them feel when you taught them that thing. And the information that you give to them will be more likely to be discussed, passed on, and shared with other people. So when it comes to things like internal security policies, advisories, whatever you work on in terms of content that talks about your security work, it's worth it to really think, is an email the best way to send this? Can I do something fun in this email? Can I add a joke or a note or a footer somewhere that I know someone will look for so that I can measure whether they're reading it or not? One of the next things I think about quite a bit is just being relatable. So one of the problems I tend to see a lot is when people discuss security in a very general sense, and I mean this when I'm watching the news and I'm turning on CNN, and apparently every single day we are at cyber war. That's not a really tangible example, and that's something that's hard for the average person to really get a hold on. In fact, if you look at a lot of the discussion of security, even in our own market, you typically get scenes of war, or you get all kinds of imagery about safes and locks and keys. Except most of the technical metaphors that we rely on there don't make sense for the average person. It works for hackers. Don't we practically have a lockpicking village in almost every security event that ever exists on the calendar? It works if you're familiar with the tools and the practices and you enjoy it and you like tinkering and having fun and breaking things. Doesn't work if your experience with locks and keys is, yeah, I have a key, I put it in my front door, I turn it and I get in my house. Or I have a key, it has buttons on it, I never actually use the key, I just let radio signals do their thing, and I don't understand how it works. In terms of using the metaphor of the military, most people never really learn about war unless it's in history class or it's in the news. War is something scary. It's not something that the average person has a lot of experience with, and it tends to sound like more of a Congress problem, not something that an individual can manage day to day when they're just thinking about, can I go on the internet and pay my mortgage? Can I go on the internet and send an email without getting all of my data hacked? Another problem with the metaphor for war is it tends to take away confidence and a little bit of agency. If you think that when you log onto the internet, you are stuck in the middle of a war between China, North Korea, Russia, and any other country in Eastern Europe that happens to have lots of malware writers and things in it, you're probably going to feel like there's nothing that you can do to really feel safe online, and it's just a toss-up. You have no way of protecting yourself, so what's the point of even trying? So locks and keys, war, they might work for people who are familiar with those particular activities, those particular things, especially if you love military history. War works, But in terms of the average person, those tend to be examples that are really hard to relate to and to buy into, and they can be used against us in a lot of ways that don't help us as practitioners. What tends to work better are metaphors that are universal experiences that people really understand. So one of the examples I've hit on by accident that works really well has been architecture. Typically, the attitude that I encounter is that people don't care about security. But the real problem isn't that they don't care about security. It's that the average person just doesn't have a lot of information about technology works. I've said this a lot. You can stop me if I say it again after this. But before we can really get people thinking about the principles and the mindset behind security, we really need to make sure that they have mental models for what they're doing with technology. People don't understand how we glue protocols and languages together. They might not know the difference between PHP and JavaScript and all of the other things we use to build code bases, but I have found that people understand buildings. I haven't met a single person who's never been in a building or an architecture structure before, so I feel like that's a pretty good universal fit. And people understand very quickly that buildings are multi-purpose. They have different purposes, just as software has different purposes for us, and they require planning. Blueprints, permits, you have engineers, you have architects, you have civil engineers sometimes. There are all kinds of people who have to collaborate to really make a building be a thing that someone is allowed to go into and inhabit as a safe structure. We've all heard of the Three Little Pigs. The brick house withstands wind better than straw or sticks. And there are some really good analogies in there for choosing secure languages and secure tools too. It's really easy if you use architecture as your example for explaining technology as well, because you can fuse in examples of security by design. For example, you don't stick the kitchen sink next to the toilet, usually. And if you do, please don't invite me to your house. That probably isn't going to go well. Another thing that really works well with architecture is if you explain a website through the lens of architecture. People get that Facebook's a big website. Say for a second, hey, wait, what if Facebook were a house and it had to fit 1.5 billion people in it? Suddenly, a light turns on. Oh, wait a minute. How big does a house that fits 1.5 billion people and all of their private conversations and all of the crap they want to put on their walls and all of the things they want to hang on their front door and share with the world? How big does that have to be? How would you build that? How do you glue all the parts together and make it happen? How do you have enough bathrooms? The whole approach to the concept of what's going on underneath that's usually intangible and usually hard for people to imagine completely changes. Even better, this is a really great way to explain security vulnerabilities. One of the most common questions that I tend to get is, well, how do security vulnerabilities get in there anyway? Can't they just stop making them? Right, that's how this works. And I realized if I start explaining the concept of building software, like I'm building a house, and say, okay, well, maybe when I was building the house, I was laying bricks and I didn't know I mixed the mortar the wrong way. Or I wasn't paying attention to how well all of my little rows were aligned, and something was off kilter. And for years and years and years and years, my house stood, but I didn't know something was wrong until I live in San Francisco. We had an earthquake. And that was one particular event that took that vulnerability in the foundation of my house or my website and shook it to its core and broke it. Then suddenly you can have a conversation about what incident response looks like. If my house fell over because I built it wrong, am I going to call somebody to grab pillars and push my house back up and make it work? Or am I just going to say, forget it, there's way too much damage, I just need to rebuild and start over elsewhere? Another example that I really like to use quite a bit is weather. Everyone has to deal with weather. I've never met a person who hasn't gone outside. If you have, please let me know. We can probably arrange some sort of intervention. But people constantly have to defend themselves from the elements, and it takes a little bit of forward thinking. I mean, we go outside every day, and we have things like sunblock, hats, umbrellas, coats, jackets, you name it, to defend us from whatever elements are out there that we don't really have a lot of control over. If you tell someone to put on their rain boots so they can go splash around in some puddles on the web when they're having fun, and those rain boots happen to be an ad blocker or HTTPS everywhere or something else, suddenly they get the concept of, oh, I have to do stuff. Okay, that makes sense. I'll make sure I do this thing before I leave the house and go on the internet. The whole concept of being prepared and being proactive is really key. And if somebody forgets to bring an umbrella when it's raining, people do understand the concept of having to come up with a really quick ad hoc protection. If it's too hot, you can take your jacket off. If you wore too many clothes and it's too hot, you should probably go somewhere with air conditioning or figure out where you can get a cold drink to mitigate some of those bad effects. Storms, just like security events, can also come up out of nowhere, and they can wreak really long-lasting havoc. Sometimes they come up in a matter of minutes, especially if you look at the news in the middle of the spring. You know, Tornado Alley, these things just blow together in 5 minutes, and suddenly there are huge messes that people have to pick up afterwards. Explaining some of the security events that we are trying to defend from in these terms can really engage people's sense of understanding, because they recognize what the process looks like in the real world of having to rebuild after an event or having to protect, and not imagine what all of these lines of code and numbers and protocols and things that they can't see and don't quite understand are doing beneath everything going on in our little silver boxes or your black boxes, depending on what color your laptop is. Another really important thing that I tend to be very aggressive about is just choosing how I frame my discussions about security. As practitioners, we have a lot of power in influencing how people feel about taking charge of their online business. More often than not, we should recognize that the average person feels pretty overwhelmed and pretty hopeless online. And if you go and do a Google search just for something as simple as strong password advice, the first 10 pages will have conflicting information. In fact, the first 5 results, which might even be from trustworthy sources, will have conflicting information. If you are someone who isn't technical and you can't figure out why you should trust one site over another, it's really hard to figure out how to move forward and what rules you are going to follow. So one of the things that I tend to think about a lot here too is our goals as security practitioners are typically to be honest and to be transparent. Those aren't bad things, but sometimes they get in the way and we step on our feet. And I say this because sometimes we are honest and we are transparent to a fault. And it has consequences. When we teach others about security and code, we tend to tell them everything that is wrong with it up front because we want to make sure that they've had those disclosures and they understand the risks. But we might be doing it at the wrong moment when someone wants to get excited, they really can't because we've just told them everything that could defeat the very act that they're about to start doing to make sure that they don't infect the entire business with ransomware or they don't accidentally have all of their credentials fished away. It's really, really hard to get people to buy into security if you choose negative terminology or everything's always on fire or there's always some big, massive, festering dumpster fire around the corner that maybe they don't understand. If you look at some of the security coverage we see on the news, we already know this. Everything's hacked all the time. The world is burning. Get off the internet. Put all the computers in a concrete thing that you're going to send to the bottom of the ocean. Go live in the woods. But we also see information like VPNs don't work. Antivirus sucks. Don't trust anything. Well, you just took away all of the tools that people have to use to protect themselves online. This is something I see a lot personally with password managers. You might get a very, very minor vulnerability that gets blown up into something very, very big. And suddenly, instead of people putting things in the appropriate context and saying, well, this class of software might have this kind of risk involved in it, and this risk affects these people over here, but not everyone, or isn't going to be something that 95% of people who want to up their password game are going to be affected by, that doesn't take that particular tool away. It says there are risks, yeah, that stinks, but not every password manager out there is evil. Don't write them all off. I have one particular example of framing things that worked really well for me. This is probably my favorite story to tell you, so surprise, second attack of story time. But once upon a time, I was in a school, and I had a classroom of 8-year-olds. And someone asked me to explain encryption to them. They're 8. They're terrifying. They are cute and small, and I'm pretty sure that when I'm standing at the front of the room, and they're all sitting down nice and orderly for 5 minutes, they're going to come at me like a little pack of raptors and rip me apart if I don't entertain them. So the first thing that I think of is, okay, these are kids. I don't know that they know much, but I do know that their general threat model is themselves. So I'm thinking, how am I going to explain encryption and get them excited? I hate using terms like magic with adults, but kids like magic. Kids like tricks. Kids like having their mind just blown to the sky and being amazed by whatever you put in front of them. So what I did was I wrote a word on the board. And I said, okay, guys, check this out. You see how this word is here? And it's all up in the clear? Yeah, okay, it's there. I write a whole bunch of numbers over it. Well, what are those numbers? That's encryption. It's kind of a superhero because kids like superheroes. And it's kind of a big deal. It's math that people tried making illegal way before you were born. Tell a room of 8-year-olds, hey, somebody tried making math illegal, and suddenly they're like, oh my God, no way, I would never have to do homework again. So I have their attention until the end of time. And I explain that this superhero, encryption, is basically like an invisibility cloak. And they're like, oh, you mean if this encryption thing is on the internet, nobody can see me? Okay, well, kind of. And they're like, all right, tell us more. So I started asking these kids, hey, so if you have an invisibility cloak, what could go wrong with it? And one kid goes, hey, well, people can see when I put it on, and people can see when I take it off. An 8-year-old just explained metadata to me and didn't even know what metadata was. That was pretty cool. Another kid goes, okay, so what if you put it on, but you put it on wrong, or you step on it? And suddenly, like, your invisibility cloak hits the ground and everyone can see you. That's a problem. Cool, that can happen with encryption. That's a thing we like to yell about a lot. And my favorite kid goes, well, what if you put it on wrong, and then you leave your butt sticking out on the internet? I wanted to look at the kid and go, that's exactly my experience with PGP. I feel you, bro. But I didn't because he had no idea what I would be talking about. So these kids are like, all right, so how do we know that this superhero is looking out for us on the internet? Well, I pull up an internet browser, and I point to the letter S, and I point to the lock, because that's the thing that pretty much everyone looks for anyway. And they're 8-year-olds. If they look for the S and they look for the lock and they want to feel protected by the superhero, that's some pretty cool stuff. So these kids are all excited, and they're asking me a million more questions about encryption and how I can get them to never have to do homework again. And I'm like, guys, I can't hack your homework. That's not how this works. But it was a pretty cool day because these kids had learned something. They were really excited about it, and they drove their teachers absolutely insane, to the point that every time they went to the computer lab and they logged in to do their math work, there was no S. There was no lock. The kids threw such a fit about not using a computer when the S wasn't there or the lock didn't show up that the school ended up having to look into using HTTPS everywhere. And then they had to turn around and they had to go to a bunch of providers and say, hey, can you turn the lock on? We just have this problem with the 8-year-olds. And suddenly, I just taught a bunch of kids how to demand encryption by telling them things in their own terms that they understood. So I'm really excited about this because they're kids and they just made their school go through all of these hoops just so they would do their classwork. And then I came back to my friends in security and it didn't go so well. Well, why didn't you explain padding attacks to them? They're 8-year-olds. Their threat model is themselves. I barely even understand padding attacks. Come on. I do understand them, by the way, but I was being a jerk. So I use this example with the kids, and I'm really excited because I got a result and an outcome that I didn't expect and that I really would have wanted if I knew I could have had it. And my own people were like, no, it's not good enough. You weren't honest enough. And I think about this a lot because sometimes with storytelling, it's okay when you are explaining terminology and new things to not throw, the advanced version of the technology you are trying to get someone excited about in their faces. It's okay to take a little bit of artistic license if that is going to be something that helps you at the end of the day get a better outcome and to have people want to be part of team security. Another thing that I tend to think about here too is I know that the average person feels hopeless, and I've said this before, about all the big threats that are out there on the internet. So when I'm educating about security, I don't explain to the 8-year-olds, there's an army of these guys sitting in coffee shops wearing like dark hoodies and stuff. They're coming at you. I don't explain things that way. I say, the internet seems kind of hard. Security seems like kind of a pain in the butt. It's actually not as hard as you think it is if you do 4 or 5 things just to start that at most take a few minutes a day. If you're able to come to people in simple terms like this and to very easily state some of the incentives and some of the things that they have to gain by doing what you're asking, it's harder for them to say no, and you don't scare them to death with all of the threat talk. So there's probably someone in this room looking at me right now thinking, but security awareness training doesn't work. Please don't show yourself. I will come at you. No, kidding. We know people do dumb stuff. We know people don't always use common sense, and we can't always fix that. We're not always going to be able to bring everyone onto team security, and there's not one big silver bullet that we're going to be able to use as practitioners to get everyone excited about doing exactly what we want at all times. It really takes a diversity of tactics to get people excited and to start seeing real results. At the end of the day, speaking poorly of users who don't understand what we are trying to accomplish doesn't fix the problems that we have, and it doesn't make us or them any smarter. Name calling does nothing. Security awareness and the education do require investment. They require time, they require patience, and buy-in. But the metrics that you see there are very similar to what we see in public health education. People still smoke cigarettes, so we know it hasn't completely 100% caught on, but we still haven't stopped running the awareness campaigns that ask kids not to pick up a habit like smoking. We don't stop the awareness campaigns that ask people to eat better or to eat more vegetables, to take care of their heart, or to exercise more. It takes time and not everyone does it, but we still do it because in general we know it's the right thing. While we might not be able to change everyone's behavior, we can at least try to swing people onto our team with a little bit of persistence and some understanding, and just using examples that work better for everyone. Some of the metrics for success are a lot different. You can't measure things in clicks the way that you would with marketing, unless you're doing phishing campaigns, and that's a little different, but also fun. You might not see an immediate result in the first week that you've launched a campaign or the first week that you've tried something new, because this is something that requires long-term thinking and investment. We stick kids in school for like 13 years, and they still don't know everything they need to know by the time they're 18 to be fully functional adults. I don't even think I knew everything I needed to know about being an adult 10 minutes before I got on this stage. And I had to go to college, and I was in school for like 20 freaking years, if you put it all together. At the end of the day, if we're going to keep this web thing, we need to make sure that everyone on both sides is working together, both the technologists and the users. So if we try to find the right language for the people we're working with, we recognize that communication isn't always words. Sometimes it is building bridges and having fun and making jokes and having a brown bag lunch here or there so that people come to us when there's a problem. That will help us figure out how to better speak security with the people we work with and our families and our kids, and to really do it with them, not against them, so they're on our side. It's much better if you're able to build bridges and someone notifies you within 45 seconds of accidentally having credentials stolen instead of 127 days later when an attacker's been lurking around your system. I'm running a little bit slow, but in case you are thinking, okay, she just gave me all of this information, what do I do with it? Where do I start? Here are a few tips to help you get started. Just in general, in the next week or so, think about how often you explain security through very complicated technology terms. Pay attention if you're using those terms. with non-technical people at work or with business leaders who maybe didn't spend enough time really learning the security principles that you're trying to explain. And maybe try out a new metaphor or two and see if the conversation outcome changes. And the next month or so, just try rewriting a security advisory or something internal to see if you get a little bit of a better engagement or better attention. For me, I send Sign Bunny emails sometimes, and I might not hear anything the week it happens, but I will hear, oh my God, that bunny you sent was so funny. Now I look for the bunny every week. Or people ask me, where is the bunny and why is it not in my email? Which also says send more bunnies. That's something I know that works for me. In the next 3 months or so, you could definitely try encouraging other people you work with to reframe security discussions with non-technical teams and business leaders. Maybe look at some of your outward-facing pages. If everything talks about trust and encryption and PCI this and DSS that and PGP this and Tor that and OTR, that's probably a bit much for somebody who just wants to know, can I trust this thing or not? And at the end of the day, if you try to embrace a growth mindset when you are talking about security and focus more on people being able to work and to learn anything instead of rely on some technological talent that they should have gotten before they came to you or before you worked together, you will get a little bit further with your colleagues and potentially with your security goals. I'm a little over, but I like to promise puppies at the end of all of my talks. So thank you very much for attending and for listening. And I will be over in a corner somewhere if you have any questions.